She did not want to be here. That was the first thought Lyra had when the carriage rolled through the iron gates of the royal palace of Valdoria, and the torchlight caught the black marble facade and turned it into something that looked less like a home and more like a warning. She pressed her spine against the velvet seat and kept her hands folded in her lap and told herself that she had survived worse things than a mating summit. She had survived the collapse of House Vane. She had survived 7 years in the service of a lord who looked through her like glass. She had survived being the last living daughter of a bloodline so fallen that no one bothered to use her family's name anymore. She could survive one night in a palace full of wolves who would do the same. The carriage door opened, and cold air hit her like a blade. Lyra stepped down onto the courtyard stone without assistance because no one offered it. She was not here as a guest. She was here as an attendant to Lord Corvin of the Eastern Border Territories, the man who technically employed her as a record keeper and practically treated her as furniture. Corvin was already striding ahead, his crimson cloak sweeping the stone behind him, not looking back. He never looked back. The Eastern Border wolves filed in behind him, broad-shouldered and loud, talking about the mating ball in the way that men talked about any event they expected to win. Lyra followed at the distance that would not draw attention. The palace swallowed her whole. Inside, the grand corridor blazed with light from chandeliers that hung like captured galaxies above 500 wolves in their finest garments. Silk and velvet and furs, scent of ambition layered over expensive perfume. The kind of crowd that assessed everyone who entered and filed them into categories within 3 seconds. Lyra had long since made her peace with which category she landed in. Invisible, unremarkable, a woman in serviceable gray who carried a ledger and kept her eyes down and gave everyone absolutely no reason to notice her. She was very good at this. She had made herself very good at this. The Council of 7 was already assembled at the far end of the hall, seated at a long table draped in silver and black. 7 alphas representing 7 territories, each one radiating the particular energy of a man who had never once in his life been told no. Lyra found a position near the eastern pillar, close enough to observe Corvin if he called for her, far enough from the center of the room that the crowd would fold around her like water around a stone. She opened her ledger. She took up her pen. She became the furniture. That was when the doors at the top of the great staircase opened. The sound that went through the room was not a sound at all. It was an absence of sound. 500 voices dropped to nothing in the span of a single breath, and even the musicians in the corner faltered on their strings, and the silence that replaced all of it was the kind that came with a particular frequency. The frequency that Lyra had learned, in 7 years of working for powerful men, meant that the most powerful one had just arrived. She did not look up. She made a notation in her ledger that was not a notation at all. Just a series of lines to justify the position of her pen, and she kept her eyes on the page, and she told herself she did not need to look. She looked. He stood at the top of the stairs for precisely 3 seconds before he descended, and in those 3 seconds, Lyra understood with absolute clarity why 500 trained wolves had gone silent at the sight of him. He was tall. Not merely tall, but the kind of tall that reorganized the proportions of every other man in the room. His jacket was black, his shoulders broad, his jaw defined beneath dark stubble. His hair was dark and fell slightly across his forehead in a way that was almost casual and was absolutely not. His eyes, even from this distance, caught the chandelier light and threw it back as something else entirely. Gold. Pale gold, like the winter moon at its highest point, sharp and cold and absolutely without mercy. Alpha King Dayan Blackmere of Valdoria descended the staircase like a man who owned the gravity beneath his feet. Which he did. Technically, he owned all of it. Lyra looked back down at her ledger. She made another meaningless notation. Her pen was shaking very slightly, and she told herself that was because the hall was cold. The summit began with the formalities that all such gatherings required. The High Elder, a man with silver hair and a voice shaped like ceremony, welcomed the assembled pack alphas in the name of the moon goddess. He announced the purpose of the evening, a summit of alliances, a gathering of pledges, and naturally, the opening of the winter mating ball, at which the Alpha King would formally initiate the mate-seeking rites, as was tradition under the Iron Throne of Moonstone. Lyra tracked the proceedings in her ledger. Names, titles, territorial declarations. The dry grain of political theater. Corvin spoke when his turn came, pledging the eastern border's grain reserves in exchange for additional military support from the Northern Pack. There was a counter-proposal from Lord Aldrich Thorne of the Northern Territories, a man with barely concealed disdain in the line of his lip that Lyra noted and recorded without comment. There was debate. There was posturing. There was the particular theater of men who all believed themselves the most important person in any room, forced to sit in a room together and negotiate their importance. Lyra watched it all from behind her ledger. She watched, and she noted, and she was invisible, and she was fine. Then Lord Corvin called her name. Not because he needed information. He had brought her for this. She understood that in the split second before she crossed the floor toward him, the ledger tucked under her arm, her steps measured and precise. He had brought her to be handed documents, to stand beside him and look useful, to be evidence that he had staff, that he was organized, that the eastern border was professionally administered. She was a prop, and she had known she was a prop, and she had accepted it because it meant a roof and a salary and the ability to send coin to her younger brother in Thornwick. She reached Corvin's chair and held out the relevant trade documents without looking up from them. That was when she felt it. Not a sound, not a touch, a pressure. At the back of her neck, like the point of a finger pressing against her skin. And the air around her changed temperature suddenly and without explanation, and her breath caught on something that was not a word and not a thought, and was only the animal certainty that she was being watched. She looked up before she could stop herself. He was watching her. The Alpha King of Valdoria, from 40 feet away across a crowded council table, was watching her with an expression that she could not read and that made the floor feel less solid beneath her feet. His eyes had not moved. They were fixed on her with the particular intensity of a wolf that had located something and was deciding what to do about it. His hands had stilled on the table. He was not speaking. He was simply watching her the way that certain predators watched, not with threat, but with a focus so complete that everything else in their field of vision ceased to exist. Lyra looked back down at the documents. Her heart was doing something medically inadvisable. She told herself she had imagined it. Corvin took the documents without acknowledging her. She stepped back to her position at the pillar. The summit continued. The world rearranged itself around the ordinary shape of the proceedings, and Lyra kept her pen moving, and she breathed, and she did not look toward the head of the table again. She did not need to look. She could feel him still watching. The mating ball began at the hour of the high moon. The council table was cleared away. The musicians found their instruments again. The wolves moved from formality into celebration with the ease of a people who had done this for 1,000 years, and the great hall transformed. Torchlight softening, perfume rising, voices loosening with wine, and the particular electricity of a room full of unmated wolves who had been told tonight was the night. Lyra retreated to the edge of the hall. She did not dance. She was not here to dance. She watched Corvin work the room with the professional detachment she had cultivated over 7 years and made notes about which alliances seemed to be forming and which were fraying, because that was information that would matter tomorrow morning when the political work resumed and Corvin needed context. She was very good at this. She was fine. A figure stopped beside her pillar, and she did not need to look up to know it was not one of Corvin's men, because Corvin's men smelled like pine resin and eastern border river mud, and this man smelled like something else entirely. Something darker and cleaner and wild in a way that made the back of her throat tighten for reasons she could not explain and would not examine. She looked up anyway. He was not the Alpha King. He was close in height, though, nearly as tall, built like a war-given human form, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes an unusual shade of amber that caught the torchlight in a way that seemed deliberate. He was wearing the silver and black of the Northern Territories, and he was smiling at her with the particular smile of a man who had decided something and was enjoying the deciding. Lord Rael Vanthorne, heir apparent to the Northern Territories. Youngest Pack Alpha at the table. Widely regarded as the most politically dangerous man in the Council of Seven, who was not actually the king. He smiled at her like she was a riddle he had already solved. "You've been standing here for 3 hours," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced. Everything about him was practiced. "That takes either extraordinary dedication or extraordinary boredom." Lyra returned her attention to her ledger. "I'm working. In the middle of a mating ball." "Someone has to." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him looking at her the way that people looked at things they were deciding whether to want. She kept her pen moving. "You're with Corvin's staff," he said. It was not a question. "I'm his record keeper." Another pause, shorter. "You're wasted on Corvin." She did not answer. She had learned that men like Rael Vanthorne fed on attention the way fire fed on oxygen, and the fastest way to extinguish them was to offer none. He did not extinguish. He leaned one shoulder against the pillar beside her, comfortable as if he'd been invited, and turned so he could see both her and the room at once. "I've watched 3 heirs from 3 different territories approach you in the last 2 hours," he said conversationally. "You declined all of them without looking up." "I'm working." "You said that." "I meant it both times." He laughed, low and genuine, and the sound of it was surprisingly unguarded, which made her look up despite herself, because men like Rael Vanthorne did not laugh that way unless they meant to, or unless something had genuinely surprised them. He was looking at her with an expression she had not expected. Not assessment, not the careful hunger of a political predator calculating an angle. Something else. Something that looked, against all probability, like honest appreciation. "You're beautiful," he said simply, like it was a fact he was reporting. "I thought you should know, since apparently no one in this hall has managed to get your attention long enough to say it." Lyra looked at him for a moment. She looked back at her ledger. "Thank you," she said, the way one thanked the weather for not raining. Rael laughed again, and this time he pushed off from the pillar and moved away, back into the crowd, with the unhurried confidence of a man who was accustomed to having the last word and had just discovered he wasn't going to get it tonight. Lyra exhaled. She pressed her palm flat against the page of her ledger and waited for the strange heat at the back of her neck to subside. And it did not, and she understood after a moment that it was not coming from the direction Rael had gone. She turned her head very slowly. He was across the room. The Alpha King stood 40 feet away in conversation with two pack advisors, and he should have been entirely absorbed in whatever they were telling him, and he was not. His gold eyes were on her. They had been on her. She understood with a cold certainty, since the moment Rael Vanthorne had stopped beside her pillar. The Alpha King's jaw was hard. His hands were very still at his sides, and the expression on his face was not readable except for one element, which she identified with the instincts of a woman who had survived 7 years among powerful men, and that element was controlled fury. Lyra snapped her gaze back to her ledger. Her pen left a line across the page that made no sense. She told herself whatever she had just seen was not her concern. She told herself she was invisible and unremarkable, and furniture and powerful men having emotions at each other across ballrooms was entirely outside her job description. And she was going to continue standing at this pillar and recording the political proceedings and go home tomorrow and never think about this evening again. The music changed. A dance was announced. The floor began to clear as wolves moved to find partners, and the crowd shifted and redistributed, and in the redistribution a gap opened up across the floor, and standing at the end of that gap, still watching her with the unnerving stillness of a man who had made a decision, was the Alpha King of Valdoria. He moved toward her. Lyra considered very briefly, pretending she had not seen him. She discarded this option because he was the king, and she was standing at a pillar with a ledger, and there was absolutely nowhere to go that would not constitute fleeing from the sovereign of the realm, which was a crime she was not prepared to add to her evening. He stopped in front of her. She was accustomed to being shorter than powerful men. She was not accustomed to the way this particular man's presence reorganized the air around him into something denser and quieter than the air everywhere else, as if the world understood that this was a significant location and adjusted accordingly. She looked up. Gold eyes looked back. Up close they were not cold, as they had seemed from across the room. They were the opposite of cold. They were burning, carefully contained, like a forge with the door shut. And the heat that came off him was not threatening, and was not comfortable, and was something that had no name in her vocabulary, but that her blood recognized before her mind caught up. "You work for Corvin," he said. His voice was exactly what she had somehow expected. Low, rough, resonating somewhere below her ribs. "I do. And before that?" She frowned. That's not a typical summit question. Something moved in his eyes. "No." She waited for him to say something else. He didn't. He just watched her with that terrible focus, and the burn at the back of her neck had moved. She realized it was no longer at the back of her neck. It was everywhere. It was along her collarbone and in her palms and behind her sternum. And it intensified when he exhaled, and she understood with suddenly vivid clarity that she needed to end this conversation and return to her pillar and not stand this close to this man for a single moment longer. "I should get back to my work," she said. "In a moment." It was 2 words. They landed with the absolute quiet authority of a man who had never needed volume to be obeyed, and her feet did not move, and she resented them for it. "Your name," he said. "Lyra." "House." The pause she took before answering was perhaps a half-second too long. "I keep records for the eastern border. House affiliation isn't relevant to the work." His eyes narrowed by a fraction. "It is to me." "Then I suggest you check the public rolls." Another thing moved in his expression, the burning thing behind the gold eyes. And she realized, too late to course correct, that she had just been somewhat insolent to the king of the realm, and that this was the part where she should apologize and lower her eyes and use every tool she had built over 7 years of careful invisibility to make herself disappear. She did not do any of those things. She held his gaze because something in the space between them would not let her look away, and she held the ledger tighter, and she breathed, and she waited. He said, "Lyra." Just her name. Her first name, which he had been told 30 seconds ago, and which he said as if he had been saying it privately for much longer, as if it cost him something, as if it was information he had been searching for and was only now permitted to say aloud. She felt it in her throat and her chest, and somewhere deeper than either. "Who are you?" she said softly, and she was not asking for his title. "You already know," he said, and the gold in his eyes was blazing now, not contained, not careful, blazing with something that looked enormous and old and entirely beyond his management. "You felt it when I walked into this hall. I felt you feel it." Her heart was doing the medically inadvisable thing again. "That's," she began. "The bond," he said. "Our bond." The word landed between them like a stone dropped into water, and the ripples it sent through her were physical. A current up her spine, a tightening in her chest, a sudden piercing clarity as if someone had lit a lamp in a room she had been navigating in the dark for years. She had heard of mate bonds. She was not so far outside wolf society that she didn't understand the concept. She had also always assumed, with the particular exhausted pragmatism of someone born to a fallen house with no prospects and no power, that it was the sort of thing that happened to other people. "That's not possible," she said. "And yet, I'm not." She stopped. She tried again. "I am not the kind of person who—" "I know what you're going to say." His voice had dropped even lower. The crowd moved around them like water around stone, and she understood distantly that they were beginning to attract attention, that pairs of eyes were turning toward this corner, and she could not make herself care about that enough to step back. "You're going to say you're not the right kind. Not the right bloodline. Not the right power. Not the right anything. And I need you to understand that I have spent 29 years waiting for whoever the moon chose for me, and I have never once told the moon she was wrong." She stared at him. He looked back. The music played. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "I intend to." Corvin found her 20 minutes later, and his expression was the particular expression of a man who had just realized his furniture had inadvertently become the most important piece in the room and was trying to decide if that was useful or catastrophic. "You spoke to the king," he said. "He approached me." Corvin's mouth tightened. "For how long?" "Long enough." He wanted to ask more. She could see it in the calculating way his eyes moved over her face. Corvin was not a cruel man. He was simply an entirely self-interested one, and in the hierarchy of his interests, Lyra had always ranked somewhere around his second-best inkpot. The possibility that she might rank higher in someone else's hierarchy was clearly causing a rapid recalibration. "Stay where I can find you," he said finally. Lyra inclined her head. He walked away. She found her pillar again. She opened her ledger. She stared at the page and wrote nothing. The burn in her chest had not faded. If anything, it had deepened, settled, like an ember that had found a bed of dry leaves and was deciding whether to catch. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum and breathed and told herself this was manageable. She had survived worse. She was fine. She was not fine. She was standing in the middle of the Alpha King's mating ball with something she could only describe as a thread pulling taut in her chest oriented toward a specific point across the room where a man in black stood speaking to his counsel and was looking at her, always looking at her, with gold eyes that had not stopped since the moment she'd walked into his line of sight. "Still working?" Rael Vanthorne again. This time with 2 glasses of wine, one extended toward her. His smile was easier now, less calculated, more honest, though she was not naive enough to think the calculation had disappeared entirely. She did not take the wine. "The king spoke to you," Rael said, watching her with those amber eyes that missed very little. "He did." "For 6 minutes." He tilted his head. "I counted." Lyra considered several responses and chose silence. Rael's smile faded by a degree, not the pleasant outer layer, the practiced, easy warmth, but something underneath it, something that looked like genuine interest tempered by genuine concern. "I mean what I said earlier," he said quietly, "about you being wasted on Corvin. You're sharp. You're careful. You've been tracking this summit better than half the trained intelligence staff I brought from the north." He paused. "I'd like to offer you a position. The Northern Territories could use someone like you." Lyra looked at him. "That's a genuine offer," he said, "not a line." "I know," she said, and she did. That was what made it complicated. Rael Vanthorne was precisely the kind of powerful man who could make her life substantially easier or substantially more dangerous, and the offer he was making was real, and 3 hours ago she might have weighed it seriously. And now there was a thread in her chest pointed like an arrow across a crowded ballroom, and she could not look away from where it pointed. "Thank you," she said. "I'll think about it." He nodded. He did not push. He moved away again, and she tracked his path across the floor with the detached professional part of her mind that was still functioning, and she noted that he spoke to 3 different PAC advisors in the next 10 minutes, and each conversation ended with a subtle shift in the advisor's posture. A slight new tension, a recalibrated deference, that told her Rael Vanthorne had just expanded his influence by 3 points in a single circuit of the room. The man was extremely good at what he did. She was still thinking about this when the evening's second announcement came. The High Elder's voice rose above the music. A formal call to the center floor for the traditional Luna presentation rite. The moment when any alpha who had found his fated mate during the summit proceedings would make the claim public before witnesses, before the moon goddess, before the assembled power of the realm. The music stopped. The floor cleared. 3 alphas moved to the center of the hall with their chosen partners. 2 with women who went willingly. 1 with a woman whose expression suggested willingness was a work in progress. The crowd gathered at the edges of the floor, and the candles were brought forward, and the High Elder began the recitation, and Lyra watched from her pillar and felt the thread in her chest pull sharply taut, and then go luminous with a heat that made her breath vanish. The Alpha King was walking to the center of the floor. He was walking alone. He crossed the floor with his usual economy of movement, each step deliberate, measured, and stopped in the center of the cleared space, and 500 wolves waited in silence to see who he would look toward. He looked at her, across the entire length of the hall, over the heads of 500 witnesses, past the 3 alphas who were already standing at center with their partners, past the High Elder with his candle and his ceremony. The Alpha King of Valdoria looked at Lyra at her pillar in her serviceable gray dress, with her ledger under her arm, and he did not look away. She felt the blood leave her face. She felt it return. The thread in her chest was a rope. It was a chain. It was something that had been embedded in her sternum for 23 years without her knowledge, and was only now making itself known, and it ran in a straight line across this hall directly to the man standing in its center, and the pull of it was not subtle. She did not move. She could not move. He held out his hand. The gesture was not a demand. She understood that clearly, even across the distance. His palm was open. His expression was the expression she had glimpsed once when he'd leaned close in the private moment of their brief conversation. Not the king's face, not the controlled predator's face. Something under that. Something that looked like a man who had waited 29 years and was asking, not commanding, asking, with everything he had, for the answer he needed. 500 wolves were completely silent. Rael Vanthorne, from somewhere to her left, said her name very quietly, a warning or a question, she couldn't tell which. Lyra looked down at her ledger. She thought about her brother in Thornwick. She thought about 7 years of invisibility. She thought about a roof and a salary and the careful narrow corridor she had built for herself where nothing could reach her and nothing could hurt her. Because hope was the most dangerous thing she knew, and she had killed it very thoroughly and had been grateful for the killing. She thought about the way he had said her name. Just Lyra, like it cost him something. Like it was the first word he'd been permitted to say after a very long silence. She put the ledger on the windowsill. She crossed the floor. It felt like the longest walk she had ever taken. The crowd did not part. It was already parted, the circle already cleared, and she walked into it with 500 pairs of eyes tracking every step, and the heat from the thread in her chest intensified with every foot she closed between them until it was not a thread at all, but a bonfire. And when she stopped in front of him and looked up into gold eyes blazing like winter sun, she understood that the bonfire was not going to go out. It had only been waiting for her to stop running from it. She placed her hand in his, and the contact hit her like lightning. Searing heat from palm to fingertips, racing up her wrist and arm and chest and everywhere, and his hand closed around hers with the careful deliberateness of a man holding something extraordinary. Not squeezing, not gripping, just holding. And the thread became an anchor, and the anchor settled somewhere in the center of her, and everything was very bright and very quiet simultaneously. He did not look away from her face, not once. The High Elder cleared his throat. He began the formal words. The ancient declaration of mate recognition, the call for acknowledgement under the moon goddess, the witnessed claiming rite that had been conducted in this hall for 1,000 years. The Alpha King turned to face the assembled 500. He did not release her hand. His voice, when it came, was low, always low, but it carried the way his voice always carried, without effort, touching every corner of the room, rolling through the silence like thunder felt before it is heard. "This is Lyra," he said. "She is my fated mate. She is my Luna. She is the one the moon created for me, and I am claiming her here before all of you, before this council and these witnesses and this moon, without conditions and without reservation." He turned back to her, gold eyes blazing. "If she'll have me," he said, only for her, under his breath. The terrible, quiet vulnerability of a king asking permission. Lyra's throat closed. She held his gaze. "I'll have you," she said. The room erupted. Not everyone erupted with joy. She had expected that. She was pragmatic. She had been pragmatic since the age of 9 when House Vane fell, and she understood that the world did not rearrange itself around what you needed. The world rearranged itself around power, and whoever held the power set the terms, and the best a person in her position could do was survive the rearranging. Lord Aldrich Thorne of the Northern Territories was on his feet before the applause had fully begun. "This is irregular," he said. His voice carried the barely concealed disdain she had noted earlier, and now there was nothing barely concealed about it. The king's Luna must be of established bloodline. The candidate must be assessed by the council. There are procedures. Thorn. The Alpha King's voice, 2 syllables, cold as iron. Thorn's mouth closed. She is my Luna. He said it the same way he had said it the first time, with the same absolute finality. But now, there was something else in it. Not just certainty, but something protective that made the air pressure in the room change. That made the wolves nearest Lyra take a half step away in instinctive deference to an alpha who was broadcasting territorial claim at a frequency that made rational thought difficult. If you have procedural objections, you may file them with the High Elder before dawn. I will read them while I have breakfast with my mate and decide how much they interest me. A ripple moved through the room. Several wolves who had been standing with expressions of political calculation shifted to expressions of political rearrangement. Thorn sat down. His lip was still curled. Rael Van Thorn had not moved from his position at the edge of the floor. Lyra looked at him because she owed him at least the honesty of meeting his eyes, and what she found there was not what she had expected. He was watching her with an expression that was complicated. Something layered, the way emotions were layered in genuinely intelligent people who experienced them fully without letting all of them show at once. But the dominant note was not anger. It was not jealousy. It was something that looked, under everything else, like recognition. He gave her a single nod. She exhaled. The High Elder stepped forward and completed the rite. The candle was lit. The ancient words were spoken. The bond that had been burning in her chest since the moment she'd walked into this hall was now witnessed, declared, public, a fact as irrevocable as the stone beneath her feet. She was the Luna of Valdoria. She was, as of approximately 6 minutes ago, someone the most powerful wolves in the realm needed to account for. This was going to be extremely complicated. They gave her a suite in the palace that she was told was the Luna's chambers, which were connected to the king's tower by a private corridor, and which had curtains of silver damask and a bed large enough to host a moderately sized territorial dispute. A royal attendant brought her warm tea and fresh garments and asked, with perfect diplomatic neutrality, if she had any requirements for the evening. Lyra sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall and tried to catalog everything that had happened since sunset. She had come here as furniture and was leaving as the queen. The door to the private corridor opened very slightly, and there was a knock on the frame. The door already opened by a few inches, but the knock deliberate, asking permission, not assuming it. "Come in," she said. He came in. He had removed the formal jacket. He was in black trousers and a shirt that was not fully buttoned at the collar, and he looked no less dangerous in the casual clothes, which she had suspected would be the case, and which was not exactly a comfort. He stopped just inside the door. He did not advance further. "I should have asked your house name before I—" He stopped. Started again. "I should have asked you before I made that declaration in front of the hall. You had no time to—" "I walked across the floor," she said. "I know. I placed my hand in yours. I know." His voice was rougher now, without the public formality around it. "But I want you to know that if any part of tonight felt like you had no choice—" "I had a choice." She looked at him steadily. "I made it. It was the most deliberate choice I've made in 7 years. He was quiet for a moment. The gold of his eyes had banked down to something warmer, less controlled, and the expression on his face was the one she had seen twice now. The one under the king's face. The one that looked like a man who was not accustomed to this particular kind of territory and was navigating it with extreme care. "I don't know how to do this," he said. She blinked. I know how to rule, he said. I know how to command and fight and negotiate and enforce. I know how to be the thing everyone in that hall needs me to be. He paused. I have not had practice at being what a person needs me to be. Specifically. She held the strange confession in the air between them and felt the bond in her chest pulse with a warmth that was entirely not her own. His, she understood, bleeding through the connection that had formed the moment she'd taken his hand, leaking through the careful container of his composure. I don't know how to do this either, she said honestly. Something in his expression shifted. I am the last of House Vane, she said. I've been invisible for 7 years on purpose because invisible people don't have things taken from them. I have a brother in Thornwick and a ledger with very precise notations, and I'm very good at being furniture, and none of that is... She spread her hands. None of that is what you're describing when you say Luna. No, he agreed. It isn't. That's a problem. Only if you think it is. He took one step forward, still careful, still measuring the distance between them. Valdoria does not need another political decoration. I've been offered political decorations for 9 years, and none of them were what the moon chose for me. Another step. The moon chose a woman with a ledger and a sharp tongue who declined the northern heir's wine and told the sovereign of the realm to check the public rolls. Lyra was absolutely not going to smile at that. She smiled. He stopped moving. He looked at her with the smile like it was something extraordinary that had happened to the room, like the light had changed. I'm going to need time, she said. I have time. I'm going to need to meet your staff and understand the council structure and figure out what happened to the House Vane petition that was filed 15 years ago that no one ever resolved. His eyes sharpened. What petition? My mother filed for restoration of standing before she died. It was acknowledged, and then it disappeared. She held his gaze. I'd like to know what happened to it. A pause. So would I, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not diplomatic. It was personal. It was anger on her behalf, clean and absolute, and she felt it through the bond before she heard it in his words, and the combination of the two did something to her defenses that 7 years of careful construction had not adequately prepared her for. She looked at the window. She looked at the silver damask curtains, and the moonflowers pressing white faces against the glass, and the ancient stone city of Valdoria spread out below, full of wolves who would wake up tomorrow to the news that the Alpha King had claimed his Luna, and some of them would be glad, and some of them would not, and all of it was real. All of it was tomorrow's problem, and tonight there was a man standing in her room who had asked permission to enter, and was maintaining the careful distance of someone who understood that trust was not the same as a declaration and did not confuse the two. You said you'd burn kingdoms, she said, remembering the phrase she'd heard attributed to him once, years ago, as legend attached itself to powerful men. Before you'd let anyone but your Luna sit beside you on the throne. I said that once, he confirmed. It's not very reassuring. No, it's not. He did not attempt to soften it. I'm telling you because you should know the person I am, not just the person I'm trying to be. He held her gaze. I would burn them. I would make ashes of every alliance in this kingdom if someone threatened you. I know that's not comfortable. I know it doesn't make me easy to love. His voice was very steady, very low. But it's honest. She looked at him for a long time. The bond in her chest hummed between them like a live wire, carrying everything. His honesty, his restraint, the enormous and barely managed thing he felt in her direction that was too large and too new for either of them to have words for yet. I don't want easy, she said finally. Easy as a roof, and a salary, and a ledger, and 7 years of no one seeing me. She paused. I want real. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that the heat she'd felt across the ballroom was now something ambient and complete, like standing near a fire, and he lifted one hand and held it in the space between them. Not reaching for her, just offering, palm up, the same gesture he'd made across the crowded floor. She placed her hand in it. The heat pulsed. The bond settled. He looked at their joined hands and then looked at her, and the gold in his eyes was not controlled at all, was enormous and blazing and entirely unmanaged, and it was the most honest thing she had seen on a powerful man's face in her entire life. Lyra of House Vane, he said quietly. Luna of Valdoria. He pressed his thumb gently to the inside of her wrist, over her pulse. We have a petition to investigate, a council to manage, a northern lord who is going to file 17 procedural objections by dawn. The corner of his mouth moved, and a very long night ahead of us. Is that your idea of a reassuring summary? I told you, I'm not easy. She exhaled. The bond sang. Then neither am I, she said. We'll figure it out. In the morning, the procedural objections came. 11 of them, as it happened. Thorn had apparently run out of parchment before reaching 17. They were delivered by a stone-faced courier at the first hour after dawn, and the Alpha King read them at the window of the Luna's chambers with the expression of a man who was choosing his battles with great deliberateness. Lyra read them over his shoulder. She had her ledger. This one is baseless, she said, pointing to the third objection. The precedent he's citing was overturned in the 4th reign of the Blackmere line. If your records room is organized, I can find the documentation within an hour. He looked at her. She looked at him. Records room, he said. On the east corridor, she said. I clocked it when I arrived yesterday. 3 rooms from the council chamber. A pause that held many things. My Luna, he said, and the words were low and private and entirely different from when he'd said them in the hall last night. Not a declaration for 500 witnesses, but something for her, just her, weighted with everything he did not yet know how to say. Knows where my records room is. Your Luna, she said, and the word fit in her mouth now like it had always been there and had only needed the right context. Keeps very precise notations. He turned back to the objections. He handed them to her. Tell me which ones matter, he said. It was not the command of a king to a subordinate. It was the question of a man who recognized where the intelligence lived in the room and was choosing to trust it. I'll handle Thorn. You handle the documentation. She took the parchment. I'll need access to the full council records, she said. The last 3 sessions, and whoever was responsible for processing petitions from fallen houses 15 years ago. And coffee, immediately. He moved to the door. He paused. He looked back at her with gold eyes that were not cold, and were not blazing, and were something in between. Warm, she thought, trying the word on and finding it fit. Warm and deliberate, and something that was learning itself as she watched. Good morning, Lyra? She had not been good-morninged by anyone in 7 years. It undid something in her chest that had nothing to do with the bond. Something quieter and older and more specifically hers. Good morning, she said. He went to deal with the council. She opened the ledger. Outside the window, Valdoria was waking up to news that would rearrange the political order of the realm, and somewhere in the Northern Territories, Rael Van Thorn was almost certainly planning something clever, and Thorn had filed 11 objections to her existence, and her brother in Thornwick did not yet know that his sister had spent the previous evening crossing a ballroom floor and handing her future to a man with gold eyes and no idea how to be soft. He was learning, though. She had watched him learn in the space of a single night, and she thought, with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had killed hope very thoroughly 7 years ago, and was now, apparently, going to have to revive it. She thought that she was possibly willing to be patient with the process. The bond hummed in her chest, warm and certain, oriented always toward the same point in the palace, steady as a compass pointing north. She had been invisible for so long, standing at pillars, keeping records, being furniture for powerful men who looked through her like glass. Last night, the most powerful man in the realm had stood before 500 witnesses and said her name. Not her house name, not her function, not the designation of servant or record keeper, or the last forgotten daughter of a fallen bloodline. Lyra, his Luna, the one the moon had created for him. She pressed her palm flat against the page of the ledger, the same way she had pressed it the night before when the thread in her chest had first caught flame and she had not yet admitted what it meant. Then she began to write, not notations, not records, not the dry catalogue of political proceedings that she had used for 7 years to make herself invisible. She wrote the petition for House Vane. She wrote it precisely and completely, with every precedent cited and every evidence referenced and every argument structured with the care of a woman who had been training for this work without knowing it was preparation for anything. She wrote it with a kind of focus that came from years of sharpening herself against the indifference of the world, and when she was finished, it was the most airtight legal document she had ever produced. She set it aside. She poured the coffee that had arrived, unasked, from a kitchen she had not yet learned her way to, delivered by a palace that was already adjusting to the presence of a Luna with the quiet efficiency of an institution that had been waiting for one for 29 years. Then she began on Thorne's objections. By the time the Alpha King returned, 2 hours later, she had dismantled 9 of the 11 completely, identified the legitimate procedural question in the 10th, and drafted a response that addressed it while establishing precedent for future clarity, and determined that the 11th was not an objection at all, but a misfiled request for military supply review that had nothing to do with her and had been sent to the wrong desk. He stood in the doorway and looked at what she had spread across the table of the Luna's chambers and was silent for a long moment. 9, he said. 9 are baseless. The 10th is addressable. The 11th is Thorne's clerk's error. He picked up the petition for House Vane from the corner of the table where she had set it. He read it. He did not speak while he read, and his expression did not give much away, but she felt through the bond the particular quality of his silence. Not emptiness, but something that was working itself out, something that was processing what it was holding. He set the petition down. I will present this to the High Elder today, he said. He is empowered to grant restoration without a council vote under the Emergency Authority Clause. She stared at him. That clause requires that the petitioning party be in direct service to the Crown. He held her gaze. Which you are. She opened her mouth. She closed it. The bond in her chest did the luminous thing. You looked it up, she said. I have a records room, he said. You told me where it was. She was absolutely not going to do something mortifying like cry over a legal precedent. She was a practical woman with precise notations and 7 years of carefully constructed armor, and she was absolutely fine. She blinked twice and tilted her chin up. Then I suppose we have a busy morning, she said. We do. He moved to the table, standing beside her rather than across from her, and the heat of the bond was warmth now, just warmth, and she did not move away from it. He picked up the first of her thorn analyses. He read it with the same focused quiet with which he read everything. "This is better than my legal advisor's work," he said. "Your legal advisors haven't spent 7 years keeping records for territorial negotiations." "No." He set the page down. He looked at her. "I'm going to have to restructure several things," he said, and she understood he did not only mean administratively. "Yes," she said, "you are." "I mentioned I'm not easy." "I mentioned I'm not either." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the same not quite smile she had seen last night. Small and rare and entirely unperformed. And it did something to the armor she had been building for 7 years that she suspected was structural in nature. "Then we're well matched," he said. She picked up her pen. "Then stop distracting me," she said, "and let me finish dismantling Thorne's case before the council session." He did not leave, but he did sit down at the other end of the table, and he pulled the supply review toward him, and he worked, and she worked, and outside the window, Valdoria turned in its morning light, gold and rose and ordinary, as if the entire world had not shifted on its axis the night before. It had, though. She had felt it. In the space of one evening, she had walked across a ballroom floor and been named in front of 500 wolves. She had been called beautiful by a lord who meant it as flattery, and called Luna by a king who meant it as truth. She had been seen, finally, fully, irrevocably seen, by the one person in the realm with the power and the inclination to make that seeing matter. She had stopped being invisible. She had started being his. Not because she had to, because she had crossed the floor and placed her hand in his and chosen it, deliberately, with every piece of herself that had survived 7 years of careful diminishment still intact. The bond hummed between them, warm and settled and certain. Lyra of House Vane, Luna of Valdoria, opened her ledger to a new page. She began to write,